In 1904, Russia thought it would be a quick war with Japan, a weekend project at best. What could possibly go wrong? Russia had millions of subjects, vast resources, one of the world's biggest armies, and a navy that looked terrifying, at least on paper. Japan, meanwhile, was still dismissed by many European powers as a newcomer, trying to sit at the grown-up table. So, Tsar Nicholas II didn't see Japan as a threat. His advisors literally called it a little victorious war, to grab a port and be back home in time for a celebratory dinner. Russia was so delusional that they packed trainloads of champagne and a literal circus to entertain the troops, but somehow forgot minor things like ammunition, reliable maps, or a finished railway to actually get to the fight. On the other hand, Japan had spent 30 years quietly modernizing its military, building its army on Parisian lines and its navy on the British model. Russia just hadn't noticed, and that mistake was about to cost them ships, soldiers, prestige, and eventually political stability at home. So how did one of the biggest empires on earth get blindsided so badly? Let's start with the land everyone wanted. Okay, to understand why this war happened, let's quickly look at the map. In the late 19th century, Korea and Northeast China, known as Manchuria, were the prime real estate of Asia. Japan wanted them for resources. Russia wanted them for a warm water port, because as it turns out, it is hard to run a global navy when your main harbors turn into frozen wonderlands every winter. In 1894, Japan fought China in the First Sino-Japanese War and won easily. As a prize, they got the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur. But Russia looked at Japan's trophy and said, "Actually, I think it would look better on my shelf." Russia called up its buddies, France and Germany, the mean girls of Europe, and bullied Japan into giving the land back to China. Japan had won the prize, then got mugged in the parking lot, and the insult got worse. A few years later, Russia leased the very same territory from China for itself. Imagine forcing someone to return a trophy, then placing it on your own shelf. That was Russian diplomacy in 1898. Japan was furious, but patient. Tokyo proposed a deal. Russia could dominate Manchuria if Japan's interests in Korea were recognized. A compromise, a reasonable arrangement, a way to avoid war. But Russia stalled, delayed, and treated negotiations like spam email. Nicholas II and many around him believed Japan would never dare to fight a great European power. Plus, Russia's only way to move troops, equipment, and food to the front was the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was still unfinished and had a giant gap in the middle called Lake Baikal. Russia was essentially trying to run a marathon with its legs tied. Japan noticed. So, in February 1904, before Russia fully mobilized, Japan struck first and struck hard. February 8, 1904, Port Arthur, 10:30 p.m. Most of the Russian Pacific Fleet is sitting in the harbor. Their officers were ashore, some at a party hosted by the base commander's wife, because nothing says imminent war like cocktails. Meanwhile, the ships in the harbor had lights on, engines idle, zero urgency. Now typically before a war, you would do things like patrol the waters, turn off your lights so your enemy can't know your exact location, and maybe, just maybe, deploy torpedo nets. Russia chose a different strategy. They did none of that. Instead, they basically parked their fleet under a spotlight and said, "Hey, we're chilling over here, come join." And then, out of the darkness came the Japanese. Around 10 destroyers in the first wave, moving fast, silent, invisible. No declaration of war, no warning, just torpedoes. Boom. 3 major Russian ships were hit. These 2 were badly damaged. The cruiser Pallada was on fire. And just like that, the war had started. Before Russia could even process what was happening, Japan had already landed the first punch. And this wasn't even their main fleet. This was only the opening act. To emphasize how much Japan was prepared for this war, it is important to mention that Port Arthur wasn't their only target. On that same night, Japan launched operations in Korea as well. They attacked Russian ships at Chemulpo, modern-day Incheon, where they outnumbered Russian vessels. Though they fought bravely, were eventually forced to scuttle themselves. Within weeks, Japan had established control over Korea and was preparing to move north into Manchuria, where the Russian army was stationed. At this point, Russia wasn't just surprised, they were in shock. By mid-1904, Japan had Port Arthur surrounded. What followed was brutal. Wave after wave of Japanese assaults slammed into heavily fortified Russian defenses. The casualties were staggering for Japan. This wasn't a quick war anymore, this was a grind. And then came the turning point in December 1904. A hill with a very uncreative name, 203-meter hill, was finally captured by the Japanese after enduring horrific losses. And from that position, everything changed. Because now, Japanese artillery had a direct line of sight into the harbor below. One by one, they started picking off the Russian ships that survived the opening salvo in February. With its fleet destroyed, supplies exhausted, and no relief coming, the Russian commander surrendered prematurely on January 2, 1905. Around 24,000 Russian troops were taken prisoner. Port Arthur, the only warm water port in the east, was gone, and with it Russia's dominance in the region. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had defeated a major European power in a large-scale war. The world was shocked. The balance of power had just shifted, but Russia still had armies in Manchuria and a one massive fleet still to come. If Port Arthur was the appetizer, the Battle of Mukden was the 12-course meal of misery for the Russians. This wasn't just a battle, it was the largest land conflict the world had ever seen up to that point. We are talking 600,000 men clashing across a 90-mile front. Russia showed up with 330,000 troops and over 1,000 pieces of artillery. On paper, they were the favorites. In reality, they were led by General Kuropatkin, a man who was essentially allergic to making a decision. The Japanese commander, Field Marshal Oyama, knew he was outnumbered, so he decided to play a game of don't let them leave. The plan was simple: hold the Russians in the center, then sweep around both flanks and cut the railway line north. That was Russia's only route of retreat and supply. If that track got cut, 330,000 Russians were going to become very permanent residents of Manchuria. For 3 weeks, the two armies turned the landscape into a preview of World War I. Trenches, barbed wire, and artillery barrages that could be heard for miles. Every time the Japanese even looked like they might break through, the Russian general panicked. Instead of using his massive numbers to counterattack, he did his favorite thing. He ordered a strategic withdrawal. Imagine running a race, and as soon as you are in the lead, you stop and let your opponents go ahead. By March, the strategic withdrawal turned into a disorganized disaster. The Russian army abandoned Mukden and scrambled north, leaving behind mountains of supplies and thousands of prisoners. They hadn't been defeated in a single knockout blow. They had basically retreated into a corner. Japan took the city, but they were too exhausted to chase the Russians. Both sides were bleeding out. 150,000 casualties in 3 weeks. For the Tsar, the message was clear. His little victorious war on land was officially dead. Russia had lost the land, the port, and now its dignity. Now they had exactly one card left to play: the Baltic Fleet. And things were about to get quite weird. As I said, Russia still had one card left to play. Unfortunately, that card was located 18,000 miles away. After losing Port Arthur, getting beaten at sea, and watching their army retreat through Manchuria, the Tsar came up with a bold new plan. Send the Baltic Fleet, Russia's main navy, from Europe all the way to Asia. Yes, an entire fleet from the Baltic Sea to the other side of the planet. This meant a 7-month journey across 3 oceans, around Africa, through tropical heat, coal shortages, mechanical failures, and diplomatic incidents, and the growing realization that this might have been a terrible idea. and the voyage started exactly how you would expect. In the North Sea, Russian sailors panicked in the fog, mistook British fishing boats for Japanese torpedo craft and opened fire on British fishermen because apparently Japan could now teleport. This became known as the Dogger Bank incident, and for a brief moment, Russia nearly added Britain to the list of countries it was fighting. After months of chaos, repairs, arguments, and enough coal smoke to pollute an entire city, the fleet finally approached Japan in May 1905. Waiting for them was Admiral Tōgō, rested, prepared, and focused. This was unfortunate for Russia, because the Russian fleet was tired, drowned in coal smoke, badly coordinated, and crewed in part by men who had spent more time sailing to the war than preparing for it. On May 27, 1905, the two fleets met in the Tsushima Strait. Then Tōgō made his move. He crossed the Russian fleet's path in a classic maneuver known as crossing the T, which in simpler terms meant Japan could fire nearly all Russian ships, but Russian ships could fire with only their front one. In the military terms, brilliant. In Russian terms, total nightmare. Japanese attack was faster, more accurate, and devastating. Shells rained down, ships caught fire, formations collapsed. Some Russian vessels tried to flee, some surrendered, some sank, and some seemed unsure what genre of disaster they were in. By the next day it was over. Out of Russia's 38 ships, most were sunk, captured, or interned. Only a handful managed to escape. Japan had annihilated one of the largest fleets ever sent to sea. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in modern history. And with that, Russia was done. The war ended soon after the Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905, brokered by US President Theodore Roosevelt. Japan gained influence in Korea, control of Port Arthur, and recognition as a major world power. Russia, on the other hand, gained embarrassment, revolution at home, and a valuable lesson: size only matters if you know how to throw a punch. The world had just watched an Asian power defeat a European empire in a full-scale modern war, and nothing about global politics would look quite the same again. I hope you liked the video. Do check out this video about the weird Wild West jobs. Have a great day.